Everybody, and welcome back. Our next presenter is Jim Lorraine from America's Warrior Partnership. Can everybody hear me out there?
Veronica, we can hear you in Cleveland.
Sounds good, thank you. As a reminder, for those during this presentation, please mute your lines. The next presenter is Jim Lorraine from America's Warrior Partnership, and he's going to talk to you about the newly formed Community Veteran Engagement Board Task Force.
Hey, thank you, Veronica. I really appreciate it. And what I'd like to do is thank Dr. Davis and my good friend Jim Wertzke and your whole team for putting this together. Got one of our representatives up in Minnesota, Tommy Johnson, is working with as we work with the Twin Cities. He's tied with the VFW in Minneapolis. If you ever go to Minneapolis, you have to go to the James Valentine VFW. It's like no other that you've ever seen. So, but thank you again for letting me present. Veronica, if you could flip the next slide. Thanks. The CVEB task force, you know, the way we came about with it is that we've been working with CVEBs and communities as America's Warrior Partnership since 2012. Right now, we're affiliated with 9 different communities throughout the United States, from as rural as Apache County, Arizona, to as urban as Atlanta, Georgia. We have a broad breadth of experience, and when the CVEBs came out, when Secretary McDonald identified them, and we were one of the first to jump on it and say this is a great idea, and encouraged all of our affiliate communities to become CVEB leads. What happened was last year we were sitting with, I met with then Deputy Secretary Tom Bowman, and he said, you know, it would be great if you, because our method as America's Warrior Partnership is all metrics-based and experience-based and best practices, et cetera. He said it would be great if you could, if a nonprofit would bring together a group of CVEBs and others in the experts in the area to come up with some standards, some measures, metrics, and outcomes. So what we did was on our own, we took the initiative, worked closely with the CVEB office and Carmen to bring together a variety of CVEBs that you can see 30 organizations, 60% of them were national organizations, 40% were CVEBs, but CVEBs from different areas of the country and in different levels of evolution. In order to get a good, well-informed outcomes, so that we could share them with the CVEBs and so that we could share them with Veterans Affairs. One of the things that I'm going to go through is that we have the task force is it started in March. It'll end in September. We have 3 in-person meetings with meetings in between. What I'm going to present to you is what we have accomplished through the second in-person meeting. We have 1 more to go, and then a follow-on presentation to the Veterans Affairs leadership, and then we'll roll out the final findings during our symposium, which is held in Atlanta, Georgia, the 5th through the 7th of September. So America's Warrior Partnership Symposium, 5th through the 7th of September is the end of our, will be the end of the task force, and where we basically now start to implement it and take these findings out to the CVEBs for consideration of whether you want to find them. Next slide, please. Next slide, Veronica. Thanks. This is the timeline that we're on. I just talked through it a little bit. You know, we started back in March. We'll end in September. We've had 2 in-person meetings, a lot of involvement. I will tell you, the CVEBs that are on the phone, you need to be really proud of your representatives who are in the task force, because they're very heavily engaged, and they're building what they see as a great template for how to measure your progress within your community. Next slide, Veronica. Thank you. This is a listing of the organizations. You can see, again, east to west, north to south. You see the national nonprofits. The reason why we picked the national nonprofits is because they have a community presence. And the approach is that the national nonprofits are there because most national nonprofits really have a developed measuring metrics capability, and we wanted the national nonprofits to help advise the CVEB task force members in terms of what can they measure, how can they measure it, what resonates up, and what impact can be pushed down. And you can see that VBA, VHA are also represented. Next slide, Veronica. When we did between the first and the second meeting, we did a survey. Had a 33% take rate of the CVEBs that were established at the time. We're not as high as where Dr. Davis mentioned earlier, but at the time, 33% take rate. You can see some of the comments. Some CVEBs were really happy with the process and how things were going. Some were neutral, sort of in the middle of how they felt about whether it was VA support or community support. And then some had some negative comments about it. But in the end, the vast majority of CVEBs were very positive about the program and where it was moving. Next slide, Veronica. Then what we also measured was, what are you looking at? What measurements what metrics should we be following? Like the example on the chart on the left is like how many metrics should you measure at a given time? And you can see the vast majority thought it was anywhere between 1 and 3 metrics that we should be following. The other piece was, do you feel like metrics are important? We didn't want to go down this road if the CVEBs didn't feel that it was important. And you can see the vast majority feel that it's very important to measure what you have. Only about 10% felt like metrics weren't all that important. Next slide. Rebecca, thanks. So then we said, what do you think is the most important thing to measure, right? And so when we went through this, the number one measurement point that the CVEBs thought they should look at is outreach. What's their impact on outreach? What's their impact on mental health, employment and underemployment, homelessness, referral network? And then it went all the way down. And where these outcomes came from these were outcomes that were listed by the VA as outcomes that could be measured by CVEBs. And these were also inclusive of measures that other CVEBs had added in. So it on the slide, you can see it goes all the way down to independence and daily living, media, child care, et cetera, in terms of the measurements. Next slide, Veronica. Then we asked, so of those CVEBs, what do you consider as your top 5? And they further refined it. Outreach and engagement. Outreach was number 1, mental health, suicide prevention, homelessness, and unemployment. What you see, what you're going to hear me talk about in the presentation is those are usually the top 5 that CVEBs are looking for. When we said from rate, what is the most important? Again, the lower number here, suicide prevention is number 1, access to health care, compensation and benefits, rural access, and mental health. Again, keeping with the theme, this is what CVEBs want to measure and what they want to be involved in. Next slide, Veronica. Thank you. Then we talked about, so what do you think, what's the perception of your role? What do you think is your role should be? So there's what should you measure, and then there's what role do you play within your community? and we compared to their current role, what they thought their current role was, and then what their desired role was. And not surprising, the most important thing that they felt was both current and desired role was to share information, to be the broker of information. The next was coordination, but what was interesting is coordination was important on their current. They felt that it was their current role, but advocacy they felt was more of a desired role. So the advocacy related to the coordination. And then as we go down through, it's education, data collection, accountability, and the least interesting, the least in terms of their current role and desired role, they didn't think that fundraising was necessarily what the push was going to be. And again, when we scored it out, it's reflected in that information is number 1, coordination number 2, advocacy 3, and then it drifts off to education, data collection, accountability, and fundraising. Next slide, Veronica. So what we talked about within the CVEB task force, in light of the data that I just provided to you and talked to you about, was we said, so what measures should we focus on? What should we encourage CVEBs to measure? What should we develop measures, metrics, and outcomes around? And 83% of the task force felt like that they strongly recommend that outreach, that we look at outreach, mental health, access to healthcare measurements, suicide prevention, homelessness, employment, and education. Now, it's important to note that these are not, the CVEB task force didn't feel like it should be a mandate. We felt like it should be CVEB's choice on what they measure, that they should have a core group, these groups here, of things that they look at, and then a pick list based on what their community's emphasis was and where they wanted to focus. If you go to the next slide, Veronica. So what we looked at was to plan for a common set of outcomes, right? This is the extension of it. And then they strongly recommend that the CVEBs include those areas that I talked about and be able to pick off of a pick list. And the desire, again, the goal is a community to look at measures, metrics, and outcomes that are relevant to the community and that relate to those community needs. However, that there's a core group that you can baseline yourself against across the country to equivalent communities in terms of size and geography, or to equivalent practices and whatnot. Next slide, Veronica. These slides are all available, so I won't read it to you, but the structure that we were looking at in terms of the document that we provide to the CVEBs is, a restating of the CVEB's mission, a restating of the CVEB's mission, the CVEB structure, role of the CVEB outcomes, activities, resources and partners, and any other reports that may be available. Next slide, Veronica. I think that is the last one. Okay, so what I'd like to close with is, okay, thank you. What I'd like to close with is that America's Warrior Partnership our mission is to empower communities to empower veterans. We see our facilitation of the CVEB task force on behalf of the CVEBs across the country as a way to help you stand up your programs. I encourage you all to visit our website, americaswarriorpartnership.org. Learn more about our CVEB task force, learn more about the suicide study that we're conducting in conjunction with DOD, VA, and funded by Bristol Myers Squibb. It's from a community-based evaluation up. Our goal of the CVEB of the suicide study is to characterize the veteran who has the highest likelihood of taking their life within your community. And we're developing that methodology. I think I'm just about on time, and I want to thank you again for allowing us to present. We look forward to working with all the CVEBs. And Tommy, thanks for being up there in Minnesota and representing us.